Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to be exploring something pretty interesting. We're talking about physical evidence of magic.
Magic.
Yeah. Specifically, we're looking at magical practices in Christian Britain.
Ah, okay. Fascinating. So we're talking about like how people blended official religion with, with beliefs in magic.
Exactly. We've got a whole stack of sources here: academic papers, folklore, history of magic, even some personal accounts. And the big question we're trying to answer is how those worlds came together.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a big one. It makes you think about, how people actually lived their lives back then. Because we tend to think of these things as separate, right? Like the world of the church and the world of magic.
Totally. But it seems like for people in Christian Britain, those lines were pretty blurry.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
One of the things that really stood out to me in the research were these water depositions.
Water depositions.
Yeah, people were throwing weapons into rivers, sometimes near, get this, medieval monasteries. It seems so strange.
Wow, that is strange. Why would they do that?
Well, apparently it's something that goes way back, like echoes practices from the Bronze Age and Roman periods.
Really? So even as Christianity was taking root, these older traditions were still hanging on.
Yeah, it's like imagine the world is changing all around you, this new religion is becoming dominant. But some things, like the power of a river or the need to appease the spirits, that might have felt, I don't know, timeless.
I see, like a way of seeking continuity in a time of upheaval.
Yeah, exactly. Although you gotta wonder, wouldn't throwing weapons in the river also pollute the very source of life they might have been trying to appease?
That's a good point. It really makes you think about how did they see the relationship between the sacred and the mundane? Maybe they saw it as a kind of purification, like sacrificing something associated with violence to ensure peace and prosperity.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. The sources mention Lincolnshire's Witham Valley as a key location for these finds. Anything special about that area?
Well, the River Witham flows through the valley, and archaeologists have found evidence of causeways, probably built in ancient times, leading from the monasteries to the river. And along these causeways, they discovered a ton of swords, daggers, axe heads, you name it.
So these weren't just random spots. It seems like these depositions were really deliberate, connected to specific places, maybe places that were already considered sacred in pre-Christian times.
Absolutely. And that just adds to the idea that these practices were really embedded in the landscape and the people's understanding of it. It wasn't just about, adopting a new religion. It was about integrating it with their existing beliefs and practices.
Oh, it really shows how interwoven these beliefs really were. There's also these ritual pits in Cornwall mentioned in the sources, which seem to come from a completely different tradition. These pits are lined with swan pelts.
Swan pelts.
Yeah, and filled with objects like bird eggs, quartz pebbles, even human hair and fingernails. It's wild.
Wow, these 17th century pits they're a pretty striking example of the variety of magical practices in Christian Britain. Swans, especially, they were often associated with purity and the other world in Celtic mythology.
So could these pits be a way of communicating with the other world? Seeking guidance or protection from the spirits, maybe?
It's definitely possible. And the other objects, the eggs, the quartz, the human elements, each of those probably carried symbolic meanings, representing fertility, purity, the connection between the living and the dead. Who knows?
What I find really interesting is the careful construction of these pits. It seems like they put a lot of effort into making them. Suggests it wasn't just a, casual thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The construction, the deliberate selection of objects and how they place them, it all points to a deep intentionality, like a whole community invested in these rituals. And what's even more intriguing is there are some hints these practices might have continued even later. Pits dating to the 18th and even 20th centuries have been found in the same area.
So while we might not know exactly what they were doing, we can see they were doing it with a purpose and for a long time. This wasn't just some passing fad. It was something really rooted in their beliefs.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's amazing to think about how these practices weren't just happening out in the middle of nowhere, like by rivers or in hidden pits. The sources actually say there's evidence of magic right in the heart of Christian spaces, like churches.
Yeah, it really shows you that Christianity didn't just erase everything that came before it. You see this fascinating mix of the old and the new, the magical and the religious, all kind of jumbled together.
Exactly. And speaking of mixing things up, one of the sources talks about apotropaic graffiti. They sometimes call it witch marks. They've found these carved into churches all over Europe. So what are these marks? What can they tell us?
Well, apotropaic basically means averting evil. So these marks were like a kind of spiritual protection, a way to keep bad stuff away. And the fact that they're found in churches, places meant for Christian worship, it suggests that people felt like they needed extra protection, even in a holy place.
Makes you wonder what kind of things they were afraid of. Was it specific threats, like witchcraft, or just a general sense of unease?
Probably a bit of both, to be honest. The time period we're talking about, the late medieval and early modern periods, it was a time of a lot of change and upheaval. Plagues, wars, religious reforms, all sorts of things happening. So it's understandable that people would look for ways to protect themselves and their communities.
So these marks weren't just random doodles, they were meant to protect. The source I have here mentions all sorts of designs: compass-drawn circles, merrills, patterns, even pentangles.
Right. And each of those designs had a specific meaning, often drawing on both Christian and folk traditions. Like the compass-drawn circles, those could represent completeness and divine protection. While merrills, which are kind of grid-like patterns, those could symbolize trapping evil forces.
Interesting. What about the pentangles? I thought those were connected to, witchcraft and stuff like that.
Well, the pentangle has a really complex history. Its meaning can change depending on the context. Sometimes it is associated with negative magic, but other times, especially within a Christian context, it represented the 5 wounds of Christ, or the 5 senses. It served as a reminder of how vulnerable humans are and the need for God's protection.
Wow, it's amazing how one symbol can mean so many different things. These apotropaic marks really give us a glimpse into what people were thinking back then, their fears, their beliefs, and how they tried to deal with the unknown.
Yeah, exactly. And what's particularly interesting about these marks is that they represent a kind of lay piety. These are the beliefs and practices of everyday people, which were often different from what the church officially taught. They show us what people really believed and how they actually practiced their faith day to day.
It makes me wonder if there's a connection between these apotropaic marks and the way churches were changing around that time. One of the sources mentions that churches became more compartmentalized, with a greater distance between the people and the altar.
That's a great observation. And there is a theory that as people felt physically farther away from the sacred, they looked for other ways to feel connected and protected. Maybe by carving these symbols, creating their own personal space of security.
So it's like as the church became more structured, more hierarchical, people felt the need to create their own personal spaces for spiritual security. It's almost like they were adding their own layer of meaning and protection to these official spaces.
Exactly. It reminds us that religion isn't just about rules and rituals. It's also about how people make sense of the world around them, how they find comfort and meaning when things feel uncertain.
All this talk about protecting spaces is making me think about those carved stone heads we talked about earlier, sometimes called Celtic heads, even though they're often from much later periods. What's the story with these mysterious faces, and why were they placed in such specific spots?
They are pretty fascinating, aren't they? They often have these really stylized, non-portrait features, and their gaze seems to follow you. And you're right, they weren't just placed anywhere. You often find them at thresholds, bridges, on buildings, what we call liminal spaces.
Wait, liminal spaces? Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Liminal spaces are basically places of transition, boundaries between one place and another, or one state of being and another, like doorways, crossroads, shorelines, places where the line between worlds feels a bit thinner. In a lot of cultures, these places were seen as particularly vulnerable to spirits and supernatural forces.
Okay, so these carved heads, with their mysterious expressions, were placed in these in-between spaces. So does that mean they were seen as guardians protecting these vulnerable spots?
That's definitely one interpretation. They might have been seen as warding off evil spirits or acting as go-betweens for this world and the other world. There are also theories that they represent gods or ancestors watching over and protecting the community.
It reminds me of some of the folklore stories I've read, like the Welsh story of Bran the Blessed. His severed head was buried to protect Britain from invaders.
Oh yeah, that's a great example. It shows how these beliefs were connected to a much broader cultural understanding, drawing on myths and legends and folklore. It wasn't just about individual worries, it was about a shared worldview that saw the world as full of spiritual forces.
So we've gone from rivers to churches to bridges, and now it seems like we're going inside houses. Because our sources say people were hiding all kinds of things in the walls and floors of their homes. What's the story behind this practice of concealment?
It is fascinating, isn't it? And it's surprisingly common. It's like a physical record of the anxieties, hopes, and beliefs of the people who lived in those spaces. And just like the apotropaic marks in churches, these hidden objects were often meant to protect the home and the people in it from harm.
So what sorts of things were people hiding? I'm picturing like old trinkets and forgotten toys.
Oh no, it's much more interesting than that. We're talking dried cats, horse skulls, shoes, clothing, and even those witch bottles we mentioned before.
Hold on, witch bottles in the walls. That's both cool and a little creepy. Can you tell us more about these bottles, like what they were supposed to do?
Well, these bottles were basically a way to fight back against witchcraft, to deflect or absorb it. They often had all sorts of things inside: pins, nails, thorns, urine, hair, even nail clippings. Then they'd seal them up and hide them somewhere in the house. The idea was that as the stuff in the bottle decayed or got mixed up, it would draw the witch's magic away from the person it was meant to harm and trap it in the bottle.
So it was like a decoy, a way to redirect the bad magic. But why those specific ingredients? Was there some logic behind it?
Oh, definitely. Each ingredient was chosen for its symbolic or magical properties. Pins and nails, for instance, were associated with piercing or binding the witch's power. Thorns were for deflecting harm, and urine was meant to repel negative energy. It was a whole system of belief that drew on folk traditions and what's called sympathetic magic, which is the idea that like affects like.
It's incredible how everyday objects were given such specific powers and meanings. It shows a whole way of thinking that we might not fully understand today, but it was clearly important to people back then.
And what's interesting is these objects weren't just passive talismans. People often did rituals and said incantations to activate their power. So it wasn't enough to just hide something in the wall. You had to do specific things to give it protective energy.
I'm curious about those rituals. Can you give us an example of what they might have done?
Of course. Sometimes they would heat the bottles over a fire so the stuff inside would boil and create pressure. They thought that would make it stronger and help repel the witch's magic. Other rituals might involve chanting charms or prayers, making offerings, or burying the bottle in a specific spot, like under a doorway or in a corner.
So it was more than just the objects themselves. It was the intention, the actions, the beliefs surrounding them that mattered.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important part of magical practice in Christian Britain, the role of cunning folk, people who provided services like charms, cures, and protection from witchcraft.
So they were like the magical practitioners of their time, the go-to people for anything supernatural.
Precisely. And what's fascinating about them is that they weren't necessarily against Christianity. They often blended Christian beliefs into what they did, using prayers, verses from the Bible, even holy water, alongside more traditional magic.
Sounds like a very practical approach, using whatever worked to get the desired outcome.
Exactly. And it shows just how complex belief systems were back then. People weren't just Christian or magical practitioner. There was a lot of overlap and fluidity.
Our sources mention specific cases where cunning folk provided witch bottles and written charms. What kind of instructions did they give people?
Well, in one case, a cunning man told his client to bury a witch bottle in their garden. He said as long as it stayed buried, the client's mother would recover from her illness. In another case, a cunning man gave someone little bottles of liquid to cure horses that had been bewitched, with very specific instructions on how to use each one.
So these weren't just objects, they came with a whole process, specific actions that you had to do to activate their power.
Exactly. It highlights how important performance was in magic, the belief that the right words, gestures, and timing were crucial for things to work.
What about those written charms? Were they like old magical recipes? What kind of language did they use?
Those charms are really interesting. They often have a mix of symbols, magical words, names of angels, even bits of Latin or Greek, but it's all kind of jumbled up. They also use astrological signs, tables, and prayers, drawing from all sorts of sources, both learned and more everyday magic.
It's like they were creating their own personalized magical formulas, made for the specific needs of each person.
Yeah, and this mix of learned and popular magic is important. It shows how cunning folk acted as a kind of bridge, taking complex magical ideas and making them to practices that regular people could use.
So what does all this tell us? We've uncovered all these magical practices in Christian Britain, from those ancient rituals by rivers to things hidden away in the walls of homes and churches.
It reveals a world where believing in magic wasn't just a superstition, it was a way of life, a way of interacting with the unseen forces that affected people's health, their luck, their fortunes and misfortunes.
It reminds us that even during times of big religious change, older traditions and beliefs often stuck around, changing and adapting alongside new ideas.
And maybe it makes us think about how traces of those beliefs might still be around in our own lives today. Do we have our own versions of witch bottles or apotropaic marks? What about our modern anxieties and superstitions? Are they really so different from the fears people had centuries ago?
It's definitely something to think about. This deep dive has been an eye-opener, revealing a whole hidden world of folklore and magic. It's fascinating and thought-provoking, and I encourage you to keep exploring. There's a whole universe of magical history out there waiting to be discovered, and who knows, you might even find echoes of these ancient beliefs and practices in your own life. It seems like these cunning folk were really important, like a bridge between the world of the church and the world of magic.
Yeah, they definitely played a key role. And it's important to remember that for a lot of people, going to a cunning person for help wasn't seen as going against their Christian beliefs. It was just another way of dealing with problems, finding solutions in a world where the spiritual and the everyday were all mixed up.
The sources mention that they often use Christian elements in their practices, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's right. You find examples of them using prayers, Bible verses, holy water, alongside traditional magical techniques. It shows a kind of blending, where different belief systems were mixed together and changed to fit the community's needs.
Almost like they were creating their own British style of magic, drawing on both ancient folklore and Christianity.
Exactly. And it shows something bigger about magic and religion in general. They're not just fixed systems. They change, adapt, borrow from each other, reflecting what people need and believe.
Thinking about how things changed, I'm curious about those charms the cunning folk made. They were like magical prescriptions, weren't they?
That's a good way to put it. And they often reflected that mix of traditions with Christian symbols, astrological signs, magical words, even bits of Latin or Greek all thrown in. It was a powerful mix of different types of magic, meant to address very specific problems.
One source described a charm for protecting a newborn baby from fairies. It involved wrapping the baby in red cloth, saying a charm that asked for the Virgin Mary's protection, and putting a sprig of rosemary under the crib.
That's a perfect example. It shows how they combined Christian elements, like the Virgin Mary, with folk beliefs about fairies and the power of herbs. It's a very human thing, wanting to protect the people we love and using whatever we can to do it.
It's interesting how these practices, even though they're from a different time and way of thinking, still connect to some of our anxieties today. We might not worry about fairies stealing babies, but we still have fears, uncertainties, and we still try to protect ourselves and the people we care about.
That's so true. Whether it's carrying a lucky charm, knocking on wood, or not walking under ladders, we still have our own rituals and superstitions, our own ways of trying to control what we can't control.
It seems like wanting to find meaning and comfort when things are uncertain is something people have always done. And these magical practices, even if they seem strange to us now, were just another way of doing that.
I think that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about superstition or ignorance. It was about making sense of the world, finding ways to cope with life's challenges, and looking for a sense of connection and belonging.
So where does all this leave us? We've explored water depositions, ritual pits, apotropaic marks, hidden objects, and the cunning folk who navigated this world of magic and religion in Christian Britain.
And what we found is a world that's much more complex than we might have thought. A world where magic and religion weren't always opposites, but often mixed together, reflecting what people needed and believed.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about how people lived, what they believed, how they made sense of the world.
And I think it makes us look at our own beliefs and practices in a new way. What are our own forms of magic? What rituals and superstitions do we have? And what do they tell us about our fears, hopes, and worries?
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. It's been a fascinating look into a hidden world of folklore and magic, and I really hope you'll keep exploring these topics. There's so much out there to discover, and who knows, you might even find traces of these ancient beliefs and practices in your own life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.